system is a cold, cold mistress. No one ever wants to find themselves on the wrong side of it, or the right side even. This particularly fickle mistress can have you sitting in an electric chair after years of trying to prove your innocence, all because you were at the wrong place, walked home at the wrong time, or were on the bad side of the wrong police officer. In the United States alone, more than 2,550 people have found themselves on death row since 1973, many of whom have been sentenced to death, some of whom were and still are innocent. So here are sometimes innocent people were sent to death row. Number 8. George Kelly. His story takes place back in 1949, where a break-in changed the course of Kelly's life forever. And get this, he wasn't even there. One faithful day, at the Cameo Theatre in Liverpool, England, a masked man stepped into the office of the cinema manager while they were counting the day's earnings and shot 2 men on the spot, and then proceeded to escape through the window. This gruesome murder understandably led to an intense manhunt, which resulted in the arrest of 2 men, Charles Carnley and George Kelly. Regardless of their alibis, they both found themselves in front of a judge, facing a very serious criminal charge and potential execution. And unfortunately for Kelly, the court case didn't exactly swing in his favor. Not only were most of the people that were brought to testify against Kelly career criminals, happy to throw him under the bus, there was also zero physical evidence linking Kelly to the scene of the crime. And most insane of all, the testimony of the guy who was actually there at the scene, Donald Johnson, who witnessed the incident firsthand, well, he was never presented in court, and his role in the shooting was swept under the rug. All that coupled with a presiding judge who seemed very chummy with the prosecution and showing clear bias for their side, it almost seemed like an elaborate plan to set up poor old Kelly. Unfortunately, it wasn't until 2003, 53 years after being executed, that George Kelly was exonerated and given a proper burial. Number 7. Mahmoud Matan.
Sobbing until I was aching, and there was nobody, and I mean most sincerely, nobody that held out a friendly hand, a word of comfort. Never mind about me, but towards the children.
Like many cases of wrongful execution, the case of Mahmoud Matan was drenched in racism and racial profiling. He was born in British Somaliland in 1923. Having worked at sea for a while, he made the decision to move to Wales, which in hindsight was probably a terrible idea. Being a black man married to a Welsh woman back then didn't exactly win him too many brownie points with the neighbors. Racialized community bullying, however, was soon to be the least of his problems. When a local business owner was robbed and killed in 1962, the police went on a manhunt, eventually decided that it's too much work, and somehow identified Matan as the culprit. He was convicted by an all-white jury based on contradictory testimony and an eyewitness report from a 12-year-old child. It certainly didn't help that Matan had difficulties speaking the language and had a defense lawyer who referred to him as a semi-civilized savage, all of which tragically ended up with his execution just 2 months after his conviction. In 1998, further investigations were done, and surprise, surprise, he was found innocent. His family was then given a cash settlement for his wrongful death. Number 6. Ellis Wayne. This right here is a splendid example of why you don't want to be anywhere near the criminal justice system. Back in 1981, Ellis Wayne was accused and charged for the disappearance of a college student, Evelyn Joy, who was eventually found in a creek, raped and stabbed to death. As usual, an autopsy was then done on the body. Thanks to that, evidence was found that was going to exonerate poor Ellis Wayne. Unfortunately though, the medical examiner in charge of the autopsy wasn't about to bring this new evidence to light, instead changing the facts with a clear intent to set Ellis up. By the time 1996 had rolled around, Ellis had already been convicted of the crime of murder. His attorneys did manage to find some evidence that had been clearly showing Ellis was innocent, but the court, in a spectacular display, decided for convoluted legal reasons that despite the evidence pointing to his innocence, his appeal would not be entertained, and instead went forward with his execution in November of 1996. Number 5. Reuben Cantu. Sometimes, the justice system is more interested in prosecuting some rando for a crime and sentencing them to their death than prosecuting actual criminals, willingly throwing a perfectly innocent civilian not just under the bus, but straight onto the electric chair. Reuben Cantu was a young man living in Texas back in 1966. By the time he was 17, he was charged for the shooting of a man in San Antonio. The key witness of the case was Juan Moreno, who had been injured in the incident and had testified against Cantu, identifying him as the killer after failing to do so twice in the past. Seems like a pretty cut and dry case, right? Well, not exactly. It turns out Ruben Cantu was involved in another incident, this time relating to the injury of a plainclothes policeman in a bar, which unfortunately for Ruben Cantu put him on the wrong side of the police. Juan Moreno eventually identified Ruben Cantu as the shooter, but later recanted his statement a decade after Ruben had been executed, saying the police pressured him into identifying Cantu because Cantu had hurt another police officer. Cantu was killed by lethal injection, becoming the 5th juvenile offender to be executed by Texas. His final request was for a piece of bubblegum, which was denied. When asked if he had a last statement, he simply said, "No, sir." Number 4. Nathaniel Woods.
It's a fact no one disputes. Alabama is about to execute 44-year-old Nathaniel Woods for the murders of 3 police officers he did not kill.
In a more recent case, we have another story of the police helping put another innocent person to death. Unlike most of the people on this list, Nathaniel Woods was, no doubt, a criminal. During an incident in a crack house, Woods had surrendered to 3 police officers during a raid, after which Kenny Spencer burst into the room and shot 3 police officers. Nathaniel was offered a plea deal of 20 to 25 years for being an accomplice, despite the fact that the only thing he was guilty of was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Woods turned down the plea, so the police went ahead and did what anyone would do in the pursuit of justice. They charged him with capital murder. And oh boy, they weren't done yet. Nathaniel's girlfriend was then threatened with parole violations and was brought in to testify against him, whilst his own lawyers were not allowed to present proof of police harassment and misconduct. He was found guilty of murdering 3 police officers, presumably with his mind powers, seeing as how he never pulled a single trigger, and was executed in 2020. Number 3. Dominique Ray. The case of Dominique Ray got quite a bit of national attention, frankly because of how crazy it is, and I mean that literally. Turns out he was executed based on the statements of a man from a mental asylum after being charged with the rape and murder of Tiffany Harville in Alabama. Getting a murder charge to stick isn't nearly as easy as you think, especially when you can't find the smoking gun. Sometimes you just take what you can, I guess. This time, it was Marcus Ouden, a man who suffers from schizophrenia and auditory hallucinations. Ouden first confessed that he was the culprit, then changed his mind and decided Ray did it instead. No physical evidence necessary. What even is due process anyway? By February 1998, Ray's defense sought to have Ouden checked by a neuropsychologist, but this was objected to by the prosecutor, who claimed that Ouden had no mental impairment and there was no question about his mental ability. Must have been a very bloodthirsty prosecutor, I think. Records from Alabama's Department of Corrections, which showed Ouden's mental state dating back to 1994, were concealed from Ray's lawyers. Dominique Ray was eventually sentenced to death in September 1999. In 2017, 2 years before Ray's execution, documented evidence of Ouden's mental situation and the prosecutor's knowledge at the time of the trial was brought to light. Ray attempted to litigate for a fresh trial, arguing on the grounds of purposefully suppressing vital evidence. But the Alabama prosecutors hadn't killed someone in a while, so they successfully petitioned the state court before him. The court unfortunately dismissed both his claims of due process and prosecutorial misconduct and put him to death in February of 2019. Number 2. Joe Arridy. Here we have the second most tragic case on the list, the story of Joe Arridy, a man born in 1915 who had a developmental disorder, leaving him with a mental IQ of 46, similar to a 6-year-old, and serious mental difficulties regardless of his physical age. On the evening of August 15, 1936, in the city of Pueblo, a 15-year-old girl named Dorothy Drain was raped and murdered in her home, and her little sister suffered a blow to the head. Frank Aguilar, who was formerly in the employ of Dorothy's father, was caught and identified as the killer, having all evidence point to him. He was executed for his crimes. So what does this have to do with Joe Arridy, you ask? Well, honestly, I wish you hadn't. Due to a series of unfortunate incidents, Arridy had found himself in police custody in the city of Cheyenne after escaping a mental institute. Unfortunately for Arridy, his luck was about to run out. The local sheriff was overly eager to get a piece of such a high-profile murder-rape case, so he took Arridy and forced a confession from him. Turns out, it wasn't very hard to get a man with a mental age of 6 years old to admit being cohorts with Frank Aguilar. On January 6, 1939, Arridy, completely unaware of his impending death, had his last meal of ice cream and was subsequently executed in the gas chamber. He was later pardoned in the year 2011 with the aim to clear his good name.